So we made it to Dallas and back. It was super rainy. Everybody's still trapped there because they got this big super ice storm that hit. But I got out of there earlier, just right at the very end of the conference. They were all going to get on a big bus and go to see Ken Jones's museum. We had lots of documents and stuff there, so I got on a plane and got home. Listen, here's what I want to do, because we're, what we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. We got 18 of us. That was about, we thought about 18 out of the 30. Look at what we did last week on Thursday is we were dealing with this number 6 theory. That we've gone through these theories from the lone gunman of the deranged gunman with Lee Harvey Oswald having done it completely alone, which was asserted by the Dallas police, the FBI, the Warren Commission, and has been explicated in some detail that we've looked at by Vincent Bugliosi and Gerald Posner. We've gone through that one and then gone up to Garrison's theory that we looked at, which you had to kind of undo and take out of the movie a little bit, which we deal with down the line here. But his theory that there was just this New Orleans-based group of extreme right-wing homosexuals that were into kind of like a thrill killing, that were kind of these bizarre crazies that you saw in the movie, with hints that something broader was going on. But that was, as I've explained, was feathered into Garrison's theory to put into the movie, which we'll get to. But then the third theory, which was the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was further explicated by G. Robert Blakey in his book, The Plot to Kill the President. He actually went to the point of saying it was clearly organized crime that had done it. That not only he moves from the fact that they said that there was a conspiracy, that Garrison was saying it was at least a conspiracy, that it was this group of people that did the killing, and that Oswald was part of it. Remember that one of the things that characterized Garrison's report was that even though he repeatedly talked about the fact that Oswald was saying that he was a patsy, his entire account had Oswald being involved in it. And then we go up to the organized crime theory of Blakey, the number 3 theory that we've dealt with, where he was asserting that it was organized crime and it was a simple retaliation against John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy for their campaign against the mafia. That they were attempting to deport Marcello, that they were attempting to go after the organized crime people and Hoffa and others. But they don't really explain in much detail why it is that Oswald was involved in it. They don't really get into much detail about why he was part of organized crime or why he would have been used by organized crime. They left it kind of vague there. And then we got to the S-Force, the fourth theory that this is the one that Trafficante basically attempted to pawn off on us as his lawyers back in 1973, saying that it was this S-Force that basically got out of control. It was these 15 Miami-based anti-Castro Cubans that were kind of virulently anti-communist and felt betrayed. And so they personally turned 180 degrees and they went after Kennedy for betraying them after promising to free Cuba for them. Led by E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, basically, who had basically gone native with these Cubans. And then we got to when we crossed an important line here 2 weeks ago, where we were starting to deal with the issue of the CIA as an institution having done it. And we dealt with the fears of the people that were opposed to the National Security Act of 1947, saying that if you ever created a secret police force that was allowed to engage in covert operations or overthrowing democratically elected governments abroad, that they would come home to roost eventually, and that's what they did. That theory, that fifth theory, is that the CIA recoiled as an institution when Kennedy threatened to splinter them into 1,000 pieces and cast them to the wind. It was sort of an institutional, bureaucratic response to the threat to him. This you could call it the HAL theory, of 2001, is that, I feel much better, Dave. I'm better now, but you're trying to shut me off, and I still have the highest commitments to the mission, that stuff. That was that theory. And what we got to last Thursday, in kind of an emotional session prior to the day before the 50th anniversary, was this more complex theory that was put out in the JFK movie, where he folded into Garrison's theory, a fairly simple, straightforward, bizarre theory that he had. He folded into it L. Fletcher Prouty's information, which Oliver Stone folded into the movie by bringing in this character, Mr. X, that was played by Donald Sutherland in the movie, where he lays out this kind of complex thing about the military-industrial intelligence complex, that there was an entire complex of these people all working together, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, and he laid it on to us in that one. And what we did last week on Thursday is we attempted to deal with the potential implications of such a deep-seated conspiracy on the part of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, the people that were dedicated patriots who had become convinced that John Kennedy was in fact a traitor, that he in fact was engaged in these kind of back-channel communications with Khrushchev, trying to deconstruct our entire nuclear arsenal, the backbone of our defense system, and that they took it upon themselves to kill him. What we're going to do today, because there was only about half of us here, what I want to do is I want to take the next step up to the seventh position here, the seventh theory that we're going to be setting forth. And as you remember, I told you that there is in fact a full octave of these that track these worldviews, and we're going to get to this one next week after Turkey Day. Okay, but what we're going to deal with is we're going to deal with Peter Dale Scott's, because it's sort of a transition from even as dramatic a theory as was set forth by Fletcher Prouty in his book called The Secret Team, in his book called the CIA and the Assassination of President Kennedy. What we're going to do is we're going to move to Peter Dale Scott's Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. What I want to do is I want to point out that in this book, Coup d'etat, the one I pointed out to you last Thursday, this book, Coup d'etat, by Michael Canfield and Alan Weberman, this is kind of the paradigmatic setting forth of the thesis that the Central Intelligence Agency killed the president. And what he says in here, he sets forth, just so in case you want to ever get a hold of this thing, Coup d'etat by Michael Canfield, I'll find it for you. He sets forth the theory very specifically, and at page 14, there's a whole discussion of this that goes on here from page 11 to page 20 in this book, where they lay it out. And specifically on page 14, what he says is that by 1963, Kennedy's murder was being planned by assassination experts within the Central Intelligence Agency. Orders had come down from upstairs that Kennedy must die, and that the recently formed Domestic Operations Division of the CIA was assigned the task. And then he says that they recruited the most dangerous operatives of the CIA to carry out the plot to assassinate the president. You'll notice that what they say here even though they concentrate on the CIA, and the book is subtitled The CIA and the Assassination of President Kennedy, that they kind of just glide over this thing of saying that orders had come down from upstairs that Kennedy was to die, and that there was an assignment made to the Domestic Operations Division of the CIA to carry out the plot. So the question that is posed by this, and it's strange because this goes on a lot within the conspiracy communities, they go right over the top of this thing, and they say that the order had come from upstairs to actually kill the president, and that an assignment had been made to the agency's Domestic Operations Division to do the killing. And so the question is, who's upstairs? You know, who is it that's apparently given this order? Given the fact that the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States are supposedly above the CIA and can give them orders, it isn't likely the President is going to be given the orders to kill himself. You do have the additional question of whether or not it came from Lyndon Johnson. There are a number of theorists who have asserted that Lyndon Johnson, in fact, was directly involved. But what you'll see is that in the JFK movie, in Fletcher Prouty's work, they basically fold LBJ into that entire coalition of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA people, that Lyndon Johnson is basically working with them, not giving them directions. It's like a cabal that goes on. And so that even they don't take the position that somehow the assignment came from above. They're actually suggesting that the institutions themselves, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA, that they had developed a relationship with each other that had actually caused them to begin to function semi-autonomously, that they actually developed their own bureaucratic momentum to actually decide that they were going to eliminate the President of the United States because he in fact had become a traitor, that he had betrayed the fundamental mission to which they had been assigned down through the years by both Republican and Democratic administrations. And they were suggesting that there was this individual president that had come into the office and that they had to get rid of him. It was their patriotic duty to get rid of him. And so that was the thesis that had basically been set forth by Fletcher Prouty in the JFK movie, and also with Jim Marrs that suggested that there was this kind of upsurge that was generated inside the CIA and the Joint Chiefs to eliminate the president. Whereas you can really see, if you read the details of accounts like that, you find this consistent reference to there being some sort of group or some sort of superior authority that somehow authorized them to do this or directed them to do this. And Peter Dale Scott is the first of the theorists that actually begins to move into that area, in which he starts to assert that, look, the CIA by itself didn't have the ability to do all of the things that happened here. And even when co-joined with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Joint Special Operations Agency, or the Joint Special Operations Command, it's called both things now, that even they didn't have the capacity, even when co-joined by the FBI, didn't really have the full capacity to do the kind of things that they did. And so that they're asking, who would have that kind of authority? Who would have the kind of authority other than a respected president who could give directives to all of these different agencies? What type of person or group might have had the authority to do this? And what Peter Dale Scott undertakes an extremely interesting analysis. And what he says here, he has this thesis that he sets forth, saying, look, the problem that people are having trying to determine who had killed the president was that they were all playing this one particular game of who struck John. And that they were all trying to settle upon a different institution of some sort. Was it the FBI? You know, J. Edgar Hoover and his FBI, their 5 Squad, the Domestic Intelligence, Counterintelligence Group, that killed the president? Was it the CIA that killed the president? Was it the Joint Chiefs of Staff that killed the president? That they come close in the JFK movie by suggesting, as Fletcher Prouty does, that it was sort of a coalition of the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command who had developed this kind of paramilitary assassination capacity that it sort of operated independently to go do it. But the reality is that the first person who really crosses the line and starts to suggest that there needs to be an inquiry as to the existence of somebody above that group, above any one institution, above any one agency, to try to figure out who might have done this. And he says this really interesting thing. He says that he starts talking about this attitude, the need for a new paradigm or paradigm shift. He says the paradigm that we're all taught in high school and even into college in political science, we're shown these big charts about how the government works. Here's the president, and here's the president's cabinet, and here are the agencies under each of the cabinet members, and here's the legislative branch over here, and here's the judicial branch, and we learn all about judicial review and how they can negate some acts of the executive branch or the Congress. And we're taught all of this stuff. What he is saying is that everybody who is a sophisticated student of American government knows that it's more complicated than that. That there are other elements that play into this. And so what he says is that, he says, at present, he's talking about the establishment paradigm of the government, of the three branches of government and the political parties. And that's the establishment paradigm. He said, but there's a need for a new paradigm. And he says, at present, there's more than one alternative candidate to this establishment model. And what I propose as a competing paradigm, that of deep politics, is that while many people are convinced that overt politics is not the true arena of power, they postulate some kind of shadow government or some sort of evil entity that in fact exists. And what he suggests is that he intends to identify what this group is. And he settles upon, on page 17 of his book, which is an important book for you to consider, what he says is, I shall focus on the intelligence community sanctioned international narcotics network as the candidate behind this conspiracy because of its involvement of so many of its players. And so what he does is throughout the book, he basically, the line through, the through line on this book is that there were all kinds of instances and occasions in which government agencies avoided acknowledging the fact that the United States Central Intelligence Agency had formed this alliance at the end of World War II with organized crime, and that they were importing narcotics into the United States to fund covert operations, including the support of the Kuomintang. And so let me explain what this is, because what he's saying is true. What I'm going to be arguing next week is that it doesn't really go deep enough. But what he postulates is this, and he spent a good deal of his life working on this particular area. And I worked with him quite closely during the Iran-Contra investigation, because we had uncovered the fact that the off-the-shelf, standalone, self-financing, private covert operations enterprise that was purportedly being run by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, the Deputy Director of the National Security Council of the Reagan-Bush administration, in charge of anti-terrorism, that when we were doing that investigation, we discovered that the planes that were flying weapons down to the Contras, down into the jointly administered air base in El Salvador. into Costa Rica and distributing the weapons to the Contras. Remember the Contras being the former National Guard members of Anastasio Somoza's Nicaraguan government that were ousted by a revolution led by the Sandinistas after the Contras were declared to be international war criminals by the International Court of Justice in The Hague. That what we discovered is that there were weapons being smuggled to them even after they'd been declared to be international war criminals, and the Congress of the United States had passed a resolution in 1984 called the Boland Amendment, prohibiting any aid, either direct or indirect, from the administration to go to the Contras anymore because they've been declared to be international war criminals. And so what happened is there began to be this secret flow of weapons to the Contras to try to arm them to be able to throw out the new Sandinista government that was a socialist government that had been established in Nicaragua. This is what I became involved in this very deeply when we stumbled across the existence of this off-the-shelf enterprise, when we were doing the defense of the American Sanctuary Movement people down in Texas. That I'd gotten called in by Bishop John Fitzpatrick, the bishop of South Texas, that when some of his nuns in Catholic social workers had been arrested with some refugees in their car. They were driving them from Brownsville, Texas, on the border up to northern Texas to apply for political asylum up there. And we stumbled across the existence of this network, and we discovered fairly quickly that the planes that were being used to fly the weapons down to the Contras in violation of the congressional ban were in fact flying back into the United States loaded with cocaine. And that this cocaine was being sold, and a portion of the money that was being generated by the sale of the cocaine was being used to purchase more weapons. And this enterprise that was made up of Theodore Shackley and Edwin Wilson and Richard Secord and Albert Hakeem and another guy by the name of Eric von Marbod. This group was actually smuggling cocaine back into the United States to help fund this, so that the Contras would have money to pay the enterprise for the weapons that they were providing to them. And we discovered that these weapons had come from Theodore Shackley, who was the CIA station chief in Saigon from 1970 till 1973, actually late 69 to 73, that when he had been pulled out of Saigon and transferred to become the director of Western Hemisphere operations for the CIA, that he had been involved in as the Southeast Asian director of operations later in pilfering U.S. military equipment, actually stealing thousands of tons of U.S. military equipment through his operatives and having it falsely reported as having been stolen by the Viet Cong. And what he was actually doing is taking all of these weapons, explosives, sidearms, shoulder-fired equipment, etc., military equipment, and hiding it out in these two great big huge air hangars at the Udon Air Base in Thailand, or excuse me, in Cambodia. And that this stash of weapons that he was using to supply it to the Contras when the government of Anastasio Somoza was ousted from power, and when the Congress passed the statute prohibiting any provision of military equipment to them, this private enterprise had begun to supply the stuff for them. When we came across that, we discovered that, as I mentioned, that the weapons shipments were going down out of the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood Airport in Florida, southern Florida, down to Ilopango at the jointly administered U.S. and Salvadorian Air Base, and then flown down into the Contras. And then those planes were being loaded up with cocaine and flown back into the United States, and it was then being sold. what they were doing, we discovered, when we were surprised to find that out, what we discovered is that that was part of an MO that had been developed by the Central Intelligence Agency, because Theodore Shackley, who was running that entire operation, had been the former chief of covert operations for the CIA under George H.W. Bush, when he was the director of the CIA from 1975 to 1977. So we discovered that this turns out to have been a pattern that they had, because the American Central Intelligence Agency, from its very inception, had been deeply involved in facilitating the smuggling of opium and heroin out of Southeast Asia through the Corsican Mafia and under the auspices of the Sicilian Mafia with Lucky Luciano and the others, and bringing it into Cuba. And I've touched upon this earlier. They would bring the heroin into Cuba after it had been processed by the Corsican Mafia, and it was being handled by a group called the Sea Supply Corporation. That's S.E.A. The Sea Supply Corporation, standing for Southeast Asian Supply Company, run by a fellow named Paul Helliwell, who was a full-time Central Intelligence Agency employee running this operation. And they were actually taking a portion of the profits that were generated by the sale of this heroin in the United States, and then they were buying weapons and having them shipped to the Kuomintang, which is the KMT, the Kuomintang, which is the nationalist Chinese in China that were opposing the rise to power of Mao Zedong and the communists in China. And so we discovered that this operation had been going on since basically 1947, 48, following World War II, and that the whole operation had been going on. So what the off-the-shelf enterprise was doing here in 1984, 85, and 86 under the Reagan administration was simply mimicking that longer-standing, deeper alliance that had been going on for years. And what Peter Dale Scott settles upon as his primary suspect, or his candidate, as he puts it, as to who it is that's upstairs that was actually explaining who it was that was responsible for the decision to kill the president. He asserts that it was this intelligence community sanctioned international narcotics trafficking operation, and that it was out of Cuba, that it had been shut down by Castro, and that therefore the organized crime people and the covert operations division of the CIA were all adamantly dedicated to trying to get rid of Castro, to overthrow him so they could reestablish the flow of the heroin and therefore the heroin money for their covert operations. That's what he suggests in here. And that it's important for us to understand that this is, as he explains it, this is a deep, dark secret that nobody wanted to talk about. And in fact, when the Pentagon Papers came out, as you remember that I was one of the attorneys for the New York Times and the Pentagon Papers, when we got a hold of the 47 volumes of the Pentagon Papers, one of the things that we found touched upon in there, but that were basically not published by the New York Times because it was considered not to be fit to print, and that there was this deep heroin smuggling operation going on in Southeast Asia, being run by Theodore Shackley, the CIA station chief, along with a guy by the name of Vang Pao, who was one of the 3 opium warlords in Cambodia. And that this had been going on, and the money that was being generated, a portion of the money that was being generated by the sale of opium, was being made available to Theodore Shackley, the CIA station chief, and they were taking the money and they were stashing it in a bank in Australia called the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia, and that the funds were then being used to help finance a massive political assassination program in Southeast Asia that was called the Phoenix Project. And that the Phoenix Project was found to be responsible for between 20,000 and 200,000 political assassinations all throughout Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. And so we discovered this ongoing operation because when Theodore, and this is Theodore Shackley, who's going to become very important for us here in the next week, the final week of our course here, coming up after Thanksgiving, because Theodore Shackley, as the CIA station chief, when he arrived in Southeast Asia, he had gone there from being the CIA station chief in Miami.
Wow.
And he had been the CIA station chief in Miami from 1961, June of 1961, all the way through to June of 1965, when Lyndon Johnson disbanded the Miami station in JM Wave and transferred him. And what we discovered in our investigation is that, and we'll touch upon this next week when we get to the deeper, eighth paradigm understanding of this conspiracy, that he spent a brief period of time after being taken out of the CIA station in June of 1965 before he showed up in Cambodia. He showed up in Cambodia late in the fall of 1965. And there was this big mystery as to where he was during that time. We tracked him down and we found out that he was in Rome. And that he was supervising a group, they're called the Gladios, which we'll get to next week. But he then shows up in Cambodia, or Laos, excuse me, in Laos. He shows up in Laos as the deputy CIA station chief. And right away, and this guy's a genius. Now, Theodore Shackley is a genius. Don't make any mistakes about that. And that what he did is he realized that there were these three competing opium warlords in Laos that were producing massive amounts of opium coming out of the Golden Triangle. And that the Golden Triangle was the source of the supply of the heroin that was coming out and going through the Corsican Mafia, a deal with whom had been struck originally by Tom Dewey in 1943 with Lucky Luciano. But the bottom line is that at the end of World War II, there was a major operation going on, bringing this opium through the Corsican Mafia into Cuba, funding the Kuomintang in China by the CIA. So what Shackley did is said, look, what I'm going to do, he said, he's going to figure out how to end up getting himself a star. He actually got a star on the wall of the CIA, this big famous wall with no names on it, just these mysterious stars of these covert operations people who shall remain nameless. And only the people in the agency know who they are. But Shackley earned his star, first star, by actually instigating this war against the opium warlords. But what he really did is he set up a process whereby he eliminated two of the three. He eliminated the two major competitors to Vang Pao. And he did this by having his CIA operations people plant these hound dog bumper beepers that you use to hook onto the bumper of a car, and then you can follow it with electronic tracking equipment. And he would have his people put them in the saddlebags of the horses and mules that were used to carry the opium out of the jungles by the two competitors of Vang Pao. And then he had Richard Secord, who was a major at the time. He and Heine Adderholt, who were the air operations people over there, would actually fly missions over the jungles against the other two competitors, because they could track the bumper beepers in the saddlebags, and they would strafe them and shoot them up and kill them, and they eliminated the two competitors. So Theodore Shackley actually lowered by 1/3 the amount of opium coming out of the Golden Triangle, for which he got this big star. But what he actually had done is he had established monopoly control over the opium coming out of Laos in the hands of Vang Pao. And then he struck an agreement with Bang Pao as a reward for him having done that for him, that Shackley was going to be allowed to get a percentage of the new monopoly profits that were being made by Bang Pao. And then he had these two guys, Richard Secord and a guy named Carl Jenkins. Carl Jenkins having been the liaison to Bang Pao to help carry on these negotiations to get this done for Shackley. And you may remember the name of Carl Jenkins because he was one of the two trainers for the political assassination group down at Oaxaca, in Oaxaca, Mexico. It was William Rip Robertson and this guy, Carl Jenkins. And so Carl Jenkins is now over in Southeast Asia, still with Theodore Shackley now, and he's the liaison to Bang Pao. And they cut this deal, and they have this opium trafficking going on, and they have money being skimmed off from that to help finance the massive political assassination program, the Phoenix Project in Southeast Asia. So so that what you had is you had two operations going on. You had one of the major operations going on out of the Golden Triangle, which is funding had previously been going into Cuba and financing the secret financing of the Kuomintang, but that had been shut off in 1959 when Castro took over. And so that whole operation had been cut off in 1959. So part of the impetus that Peter Dale Scott argues, the impetus for attempting to eliminate Castro was to reestablish that covert heroin trafficking operation. And so what he says is that the entire investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy was designed in part to avoid not only discovering that there had been a political assassination team put together in 1960 to assassinate Fidel Castro, and the fact that that particular group had done the 180-degree turn and killed the president. But there was also the desire to conceal the fact that this whole operation was designed to reopen the heroin trafficking with organized crime. And so that there was this strange amalgamation of organized crime, narcotics trafficking, one of their specialties, and the covert operations and the funding of the Kuomintang that was a big secret that had to be concealed. And so that every time anybody involved in the investigation got near that subject matter, it was like a third rail, and they didn't want to go near that. And so they would back away and not deal with it. And what Peter Dale Scott is saying is that what is really necessary in order to understand the assassination is you have to actually have a complete different paradigmatic view of our government. And what he says is that the government, our government, is if you think of this restructured vision of our government, you will see that our entire government exists. It's a structural rearrangement, which has to include organized crime and their major drug trafficking as a fundamental pillar of our imperial system. And so he said that is a dark family secret of post-World War II America, that there is this alliance between the highest echelons of our government in both political parties with organized crime. Because organized crime has actually begun to provide the heroin trafficking, which is used to supply funds for the covert operations, such as financing the military equipment supply to the Kuomintang in China. And that dark secret is something that undermined the ability, indeed, as he argues, undermined the willingness on the part of the upper echelons of the investigative agencies that were engaged in investigating the assassination of President Kennedy. It caused them to consciously avoid going anywhere near that. And that's why Jack Ruby, which he focuses upon, he said, look, they kept on talking about Jack Ruby as though he was just some little two-bit guy basically running a nightclub, you know, the Carousel Club. And there was some minor suspicion that some of the police in Dallas used to patronize or you know, the place, but that was all. And they said, oh yeah, and they even went so far, the House Select Committee on Assassinations actually went so far as to say, well, he certainly was acquainted. He was certainly acquainted with a number of people that were in the organized crime community in Dallas, but only because they used to frequent his Carousel Club. Whereas in fact, it turns out, as he goes into some length to point out, is that Jack Ruby actually arrived down in Dallas, coming from Chicago, and was an intimate part of the Chicago Mafia under Santos Trafficante, taking over the drug trade in Dallas, as well as the organized gambling and also the prostitution activities. And that therefore Jack Ruby is much more intimately involved with this secret power structure in Dallas than anybody wanted to admit. Yes, Greg?
I didn't know if you covered it before, but I know you can look it up, that when Ruby at one point was arrested in Chicago, there was an instance when Richard Nixon actually interceded to get him out of jail.
That's right. Because it turns out
much earlier than that.
It turns out that Jack Ruby, when he was back in Chicago, had in fact become a witness, an informant for a major investigation that was going on about the murder of one of the big major bookies in Chicago. And he'd become an actual informant for the FBI. But subsequent to that time, he was part of the organized crime movement of going down into Dallas and taking over the narcotics and gambling and prostitution activities in Dallas. And so that his Carousel Club was a lot more than just a place that used to be patronized by some members of the Dallas Police Department. It was a hub of organized crime in Dallas. And Peter Dale Scott says that because of the fervent desire that everybody on the in Washington had in not wanting to expose that connection between intelligence activities and the narcotics smuggling, that they avoided that entirely. I think I told you one time, if I have, don't stop me. But when I first arrived in Washington D.C. back in 1975, one of the guys I ended up meeting was this guy named Robert Fink. Robert Fink was the chief investigator for Bella Abzug. Bella Abzug was the congresswoman from New York City who chaired the House Judiciary Committee's subcommittee on individual rights. And during the Church Committee hearings, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse hearings, there was a correlative House committee set up under Otis Pike from New York, the congressman from New York. And they had the Pike Committee, which is where Dan Shore got in all the trouble of leaking information that was coming out of the Pike Committee. The bottom line is that Bella Abzug seconded her chief investigator, Bob Fink, to work for the Pike Commission. So the Pike Committee knew all kinds of the same things that the Church Committee knew. And Bob Fink, I was sitting talking to Bob Fink one afternoon in 1975, and I was quite disturbed by the fact that I had discovered during my review of the papers, the Pentagon papers, and stuff that had been left out of them, which I was disturbed about, was the existence of this heroin trafficking operation that was going on in Southeast Asia. And so I began to talk with Bob about it, and I said, you know, the CIA itself was directly involved in heroin smuggling. And Bob said to me, he said, look, Dan, if anybody was so naive that they didn't know that the CIA was involved in heroin smuggling in Southeast Asia, they would be too naive to function in Washington. He said, but on the other hand, if anybody were to attempt to, no, he said you'd be too ignorant Said if anybody didn't know that the CIA was smuggling heroin out of Southeast Asia, they would be too ignorant to function effectively in Washington. But if anybody were to try to reveal this to the American public, they would be too naive to ever be able to function effectively in Washington, D.C. And so what he was saying to me right there, here I am sitting at the Jesuit headquarters, the national headquarters of the United States, sitting there with the chief investigator, Rebecca Abzug, who's the chair of one of the committees in Congress, and he's sitting there telling me, oh yes, we know all about the heroin smuggling by the Central Intelligence Agency, but you can't tell anybody. Basically, if you tell anybody, you'll get run out of Washington, and you won't be part of the club. And so I determined right at that point that I was going to tell everybody I could and see if anybody would do anything about it, but they didn't. And in fact, that's when we got that special committee set up. Remember I told you I went to see Tip O'Neill, and we got the special select committee set up in the Senate after we won after the Democrats won the election in November of 1986. The committee that they set up was the Senate Select Committee on Narcotics and Terrorism. And that was the nexus. That was the nexus because the terrorist operations, which I will tell you about next week, of how we get at. In fact, I did tell you this. Remember, I told you the thing about the fellow that said, "I just wanted to make sure that you knew who you were dealing with." Okay, that was Nasser Haro standing right there. Nasser Haro was the head of the DFS in Mexico. I told you, in the Mexico City station, and what they were talking about is a major cocaine cartel that was being run out of Colombia, out of Medellin. They were transporting cocaine into the United States and using the income from the cocaine trafficking to finance their war without boundaries against your enemies and ours, as those Nazi guys said. They were sitting there at the table insulting. And so that what we've got here is a deep and dark secret. And I should tell you about basically how it came about. That what happened is in 1943. Remember, I told you that on February 3rd of 1943, when the Fifth Army of Germany was defeated in front of the gates of Stalingrad, deep into the winter of 1943, when Hitler had made the stupid mistake of sending his entire military of the 5th and 6th Army, the German Army, into Russia, and that they had gotten bogged down in the winter out in front of the gates of Stalingrad, doing a major siege of Stalingrad. And they basically froze to death and starved to death, and therefore ended up surrendering on February 3rd of 1943. And this turns out to have been just 6 months after the United States 6th Fleet in the Pacific had utterly destroyed the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. So within 6 months, June of 1942 at the Battle of Midway and the Battle of Stalingrad, February of 1943, the end of it, that both of them had been defeated. And so people began to realize that the Allies were going to win World War II, that they had broken the back of the German military there, they'd broken the back of the Japanese Navy in the Pacific, and so they knew that this was getting ready to happen. And so what happened as starting in 1943, this effort started to be made to figure out how they were going to ally themselves with the West. That the Germans knew that they were getting set to lose the war, and so they had to start figuring out now how they were going to realign themselves to be allies of the Western powers. And this is what we're going to take a look at here in the 8th paradigm. But what we discovered, what happened is that right when the Western Allies were starting now to figure out their plan to actually invade, that they were going to mount a huge invasion force to invade into Europe. And they were going to send in the Fifth Army, Patton's Fifth Army. They were pulling them out of North Africa, and they were going to bring them into Sicily, Salerno, in November. And they were going to have the major attack take place at Normandy on June 6th of 1944. So, but in late 1943, after the February defeat of the German army in Stalingrad, what happened is an overture was undertaken by Thomas Dewey. Thomas Dewey, at that time, was the governor of New York. He had been what they refer to as the crusading district attorney down in New York City, and he had prosecuted a number of organized crime figures, including Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano was a major mob guy, and Tom Dewey had prosecuted him and convicted him, and he was imprisoned. Lucky Luciano was imprisoned at Great Meadows Prison in Comstock, New York. That's a little place in the mountains in the Adirondacks up north of Lake George, about 75 miles north of Albany, about 250 miles north of New York, up in the kind of beautiful Adirondacks. And there's this great big maximum security prison where all the high-end white-collar criminals from New York got put. And Tom Dewey sent his emissary up there in 1943, in fall of 1943, actually earlier than that, in late summer of 1943. He sent his emissary up to negotiate with Lucky Luciano, to get Lucky Luciano to agree to provide scouts for the American forces when they landed at Salerno and they came into Sicily, that they needed to have scouts who knew the area through the mountains to help them get there. And Patton was pursuant to this agreement that was struck. In the person, you're going to love this, the person that Tom Dewey sent to conduct the negotiations with Lucky Luciano in the late summer of 1943 was, in fact, Murray Gurfein. That Murray Gurfein ended up being the judge appointed by Richard Nixon to be the judge in the Pentagon Papers case. Later on, in 1970, 71. But Murray Gurfein, at this time, was a special assistant district attorney in New York City. And Tom Dewey reached down from his position as the governor and sent Murray Gurfein to the prison, carried out a series of negotiations, pursuant to which Lucky Luciano, in exchange for being freed from prison, from the term that was given to him by Tom Dewey, agreed to go back to Sicily and would do three things. First, they would agree to provide scouts for the American landing forces so that they could work their way on through the mountains and get all the way up to Rome and seize the territory, the Italian fascists, to oust the Italian fascists under Mussolini. Secondly, what they would agree to do is they would agree to put spies from the mob, the mafia, inside the Longshoremen's Union, all along the coasts of the East Coast and the Gulf Coast and the Western Coast. They would infiltrate the labor unions with organized crime figures, and they would beat up and kill and intimidate any socialists or Nazis that they found there, allegedly. But now, given the political makeup of the mafia in Sicily and Italy, is they were fascist. And so what they did is they selectively, and it wasn't any great surprise to Dewey or anybody else, that they basically focused on stopping not only any socialists to come into the Longshoremen's Union and the Teamsters Union, but they in fact took over those unions, and they basically excluded not only socialists, but in fact genuine labor organizers, whom they viewed to be socialists. And so that was the second thing that the agreement generated with Lucky Luciano and Murray Gurfein on behalf of Tom Dewey in the summer of 1943. And it turns out that the third thing that they did is that they agreed to process the heroin, the opium that was being trafficked out of Southeast Asia at the end of World War II. They would process the opium into heroin, and that they would participate in smuggling the heroin from France and Corsica. They would bring it into Cuba. And they had this whole operation going on of opium coming from Southeast Asia through the Corsican Mafia down into Cuba, and then on up through into the United States under the supervision of Santos Trafficante, who was the client, as I discovered to my surprise, of F. Lee Bailey, in whose office I was. Okay? And so that's how that whole operation was going. And so that when, in fact, Fidel Castro overthrew Batista on January 1st of 1959 and ousted all those mafioso, it wasn't just their gambling casinos, which everybody talks about a lot, that got stopped. It was the heroin trafficking that was a central feature of the covert operations funding that was going on by the Central Intelligence Agency of the Kuomintang in China. And so there was this huge strategic objective that they all shared in common to get rid of Fidel Castro. So that's the actual operation that we saw endangered by the existence of Fidel Castro. And that's why when Richard Nixon contacted Howard Hughes and asked, this is in 1960 now, in late June of 1960, once Nixon realized he was going to get the Republican nomination for the presidency in June of 1960, when Nixon contacted Howard Hughes to have him set up a political assassination operation, it was because Howard Hughes was in Las Vegas, living upstairs in the Sands, in the big penthouse suite, the Sands Hotel being owned by the mafia. And so Howard Hughes then, when his lawyer, Bob Mayu, reached out directly to Johnny Roselli, who was one of the major bagmen for Sam Giancana from the mafia in Chicago, the people that owned the Sands Hotel. And so that it was to be expected, I dare say that it was quite to be expected that these people would be perfectly desirous of getting rid of Fidel Castro. And so now what they had is they had the imprimatur, they had the request coming to them directly from Richard Nixon, who they all anticipated was going to be president of the United States in the next election. So what Peter Dale Scott is pointing out, that there is a deep secret that actually is known about at the highest echelons of the American government, inside the Republican and Democratic Party, that ever since World War II, there has been this deep alliance between the covert operations people of the Central Intelligence Agency and organized crime. And for that reason, they were consistently trying to avoid getting near that. And so throughout the Watergate hearing, when they discovered that these Cuban guys, these Martinez and Gonzalez and Barker, when they were found in the Watergate Hotel burglarizing the place, you kept hearing about, oh, there were these Miami Cubans. But nobody wanted to talk to you about the fact that they were gunmen for Santos Trafficante. You know, and that they just happened to also be employees of the Central Intelligence Agency. You know, so that they were all three of those things at the same time. So we began to, as I told you, when Santos Trafficante got the request to set up the assassination team to kill Castro, what he did wisely is he not only confirmed that it was Nixon asking him to do it by having Sheffield Edwards come and give him the green light on the thing, but what he did is, as I pointed out, he selected people that were his own gunmen, that were protecting the heroin trade and the casinos in Havana prior to January of 1959. He picked those people who were working for the Central Intelligence Agency, who were his mafia gunmen, to actually carry out the assassination. So that if they were caught, the CIA would have to use all of its considerable power to conceal their involvement in killing Castro. And so these guys were in a perfect position to carry out a deep and dark conspiracy to kill anyone they wanted to. And that if anybody tried to investigate them, there were all kinds of masks and double masks of who they were. And that's precisely what happened. And what Peter Dale Scott is saying is that, look, it's important for us to remember that it wasn't just the CIA as an institution, and it wasn't just the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of whom were livid about what Kennedy was doing, but that it was in fact this other deeper political power in the United States, this alliance between organized crime and the Covert Operations Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency, that these people stood outside of the law. They were outside of the law, and that they existed at a secret level that was so deep into the core, into the heart of the United States government at the time, that in fact, this group could not be talked about. And for that reason, they all joined together to conceal who it was that might have killed the president. And so that their major challenge wasn't trying to figure out who killed the president. Their major challenge was trying to conceal all of these different operations that have been going on, to conceal them from the American people. And so that they came up with this plan to lay it all onto this one deranged gunman. And that they figured that if they did that, nobody would ever find out. You know, nobody would ever discover that there was something wrong with what was going on. Because up until that point in time, these people were not used to being challenged by anybody. Everybody believed the government. Everybody believed that the government was doing the right thing. Everybody was patriotic. Everybody thought, all the guys thought, you have to go in and do 2 years in the military. And we never thought about the fact that this was the first time that there was a major standing army, that the United States had a major standing army for the first time. The very thing that George Washington warned us against. And nobody quite understood what Eisenhower was talking about in January of 1961, when he in his farewell speech said, look, you need to be careful about this new military-industrial complex that has arisen. And there was actually an earlier draft of his speech in which he referred to it as the military intelligence industrial establishment, the complex. And so that this is something that people were warning about, but at the same time, when a president comes into office, they were making use of it. So that even John Kennedy made use of it. He rolled into place and accepted this attempt to have a covert operation go on at the Bay of Pigs and overthrow the island of Cuba. He went along with having the Operation 40 be transformed into Operation Mongoose. He did not agree with the assassination program. And he did not agree with allowing them to use direct U.S. military aircraft in the United States Marines to go in and overthrow the island of Cuba, because he was in a conflicted position, because he was more of a liberal than most of them. And so what Peter Dale Scott is doing is he is posing a thesis as to what went on. The deep politics that he's referring to is this deep, dark secret about the alliance between the Covert Operations Division of the Central Intelligence Agency and the international narcotics trafficking, heroin trafficking operations going on to help fund the Kuomintang in Southeast Asia, or in China. So that's what he's telling us about. And what I'll point out, and I want us to segue from this, because when we get together on Tuesday, because what he does is, during his focus on this international narcotics trafficking operation that's going on, he is ignoring a basic truth, and that is, it's well worth mentioning it again as we get ready. We'll start having some discussions for the next 15, 20 minutes. But that I want to focus again that what happened is when right after I filed the Iran-Contra case, I told you again, and as I say, this is well worth repeating, so you'll remember this, is that when I came back from the meetings with Tip O'Neill, Pell, Claiborne Pell, to get them to establish a special select committee in the Congress to actually conduct investigations of this off-the-shelf enterprise that I had identified. When I came back to the office, the man who was sitting there waiting for me, you'll remember, was Richard Billings, who was the chief of staff of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And he had been fascinated by the fact that not only had I named Theodore Shackley as one of the defendants in running the off-the-shelf enterprise here in 1986, but that I named several people who were members of the S-Force that were actually participants in the assassination of the president. That Felix Rodriguez was in there, Rafael Chichi-Quintero was in there, Orlando Martinez was in there, Felipe Vidal was in there. These were a whole bunch of people that Dick Billings recognized right away when he saw them. And so when he asked me who I thought the most important defendant was that I had named, I told him that it was Theodore Shackley. And when he asked me why that was, I told him that a lot of people would think that the reason that he was the most important was because he was the director of covert operations in the CIA for George H.W. Bush, who was now the vice president of the United States under Reagan, and that Vice President George H.W. Bush's national security advisor, Donald P. Gregg, was actually the CIA case officer for Felix Rodriguez, who was running the Ilopango air operation. And that's when he said to me, but that isn't the reason? That isn't the reason he's the most important? And I said, no. I said, it was because he was the CIA station chief in Miami on November 22nd of 1963. And that's when he got up and came across and shook my hand and said, my name is Dick Billings. I was the chief staff writer for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I think we can help each other out. And that's when he said to me, he says, there's a guy that you need to meet. There's a guy that you need to meet that wants to talk to you. And I agreed to meet with somebody, whoever it is he wanted me to meet with the next day. This was like on June 2nd or 3rd of 1986. And he asked me to come to lunch with him and meet this fellow. I agreed to do it, and the next day I went over to the Dubliner Cafe at the bottom of Capitol Hill. I told you this. I hope I'm seeing guys lighting up saying, I remember this. But I'm saying to you, I want you to understand what happened here. Is that there he is waiting for me in front of the Dubliner, and I go over and shake his hand. He invites me in. We come in, and here's this guy, maybe 70-year-old guy, sitting in the Dubliner Cafe all by himself. And I go over to him, and Dick Billings brings me over and says, Dan Sheehan, Joe Smith. Joe Smith, Dan Sheehan. And I shook his hand. I said, yeah, right, Joe Smith. And he said, no, I get that a lot. My name is Joseph Burkholder Smith. And I was the deputy CIA station chief in 1973 in Mexico City. Now you got to remember how important this is now, because these investigations, the Select Committee investigation of the Watergate burglary was going on in 1973, in May of 1973. And the key feature of the investigation that they were all terrified about is the fact that Bernard Barker had this check in his pocket when he was arrested in the Watergate Hotel that had been drawn on the Banco Internacional in Mexico City. And Mexico City is the place that had the account of Ogario in the Banco Internacional that was used to fund the assassination base in Oaxaca, Mexico, back in 1960. So that Mexico station becomes extremely important. And so here he is, the deputy station chief of the CIA in Mexico City back in 1973, and he tells me that when Shackley, one of the defendants that I had named and was going to be getting to do his deposition and demand documentation and proof of his travels and everything else, that when Shackley became the director of Western Hemisphere operations for the CIA back in 1973, he had dismissed all of the station chiefs, all of the CIA station chiefs throughout the Western Hemisphere, and had put in his own men. And the guy that he put in charge in Mexico City was Tom Polgar. And I told you that there's Joseph Burkholder Smith sitting there talking to me at the Dubliner Hotel on like the 3rd of June of 1986. And he's sitting there telling me that the next morning, Polgar walks into his office, into Joe's office, and says, "Joe, I don't know whether we're going to be able to leave you on here as the deputy. But there's going to be a guy coming to your office tomorrow. You'll recognize who he is, and he's going to ask you some questions. And depending upon how you answer those questions, that'll determine whether you're going to be left on as the deputy station chief." He said, and he may even have you want to go somewhere with him and meet some other people who will have some questions. And depending upon how you answer those questions, that'll determine whether or not you'll be able to be left on here. And he said the next morning, through his door at 10 o'clock in the morning, walks Nasser Haro. Nasser Haro walks in and says, "Hi, Joe." He said, basically, Polgar told you that, I might be wanting you to go and meet some people, and they'd have some questions for you, and I want to know whether you'll come with me. So he did, and they went downstairs. I told you, went downstairs, got into one of the smoke glass windows of this Suburban, and they drive into the airport at Mexico City. They go around all of the security, and they get into this Learjet, and they fly away, and they fly and fly, and they fly all the way to Rio de Janeiro in Argentina. And they land, and they get out of the Learjet, and they go around the security, get in a helicopter, and they fly away. They land in Argentina. They land in Argentina. And they land in Argentina, and he gets out, and he gets into a helicopter, and they fly away. And they fly all the way to the northwestern tip of Argentina and land on the soccer field. And he gets out of the helicopter behind Nasser Haro, and he follows them all, and they're in this little town called Salta in Argentina. And they walk up over the embankment. He follows Nasser Haro, and he looks over the embankment, and he said, "I thought I was in Bavaria," he said. And he follows him down into this little Bavarian town, and they take him to this little Bavarian inn, and he walks in, and here are these 6 guys sitting there at this great big huge oaken table in front of a big stone fireplace, on the mantle of which is a swastika flag. And this is 1973. And here's the swastika flag, and they gesture for him to sit down, and he sits down, and the guy says to him, "Joe, you were told that we may have some questions for you, and how you answer these questions may determine whether you're going to get to be left on as a deputy station chief for the agency." And so he says, "Look, we have spent a lot of time and effort building this big cocaine cartel down in Medellin. And we're going to be developing this cocaine, we're going to be selling it in the United States, and a portion of the profits is going to be used to help finance this war without boundaries against your enemies and ours. And I just wanted to make sure that if you're going to be left on as the deputy station chief, you aren't going to do anything to interfere with that traffic." I told you. Then he said to me, "And I swear to God, Dan, I don't know what I ever had done, what I'd ever done that would have led them to believe that I would have gone along with that." And I said, "Well, how about being the deputy CIA station chief in Mexico City for a start?" And he said, "Oh, well," to Dick, he said, "Oh, I thought he was going to be cooperative." And Dick said, "Look, I just met him." He said, "But that's when he comes over, gets up, and comes over and sticks his hand out and shakes my hand and leans over and looks at me and said, I just wanted to make sure that if you're going to be doing a lawsuit like this, you knew who it was that you were really dealing with." And what he's saying is that the Nazis, the fascists that were in Argentina, that had come over after the war, World War II, that were in Argentina, were calling the shots as to who the deputy CIA station chief was going to be in Mexico City. Okay? And so the problem is that Peter Dale Scott, when he touches upon Nasser Haro, says he was well known to be involved in the narcotics trade in Mexico, which he was. But the fact of the matter is, he was a rock-ribbed fascist. And those people were all fascists that were there. And there was an alliance of fascists that were in South America. And that they had come over directly at the end of World War II. And that they'd been pulled out of there by Otto Skorzeny Otto Skorzeny was the major general that was in charge of the elite special forces in the SS during World War II, a group called the Werewolves. And that he ran that operation, and he is the guy that ran Odessa, which is the operation smuggling major Nazi war criminals out of Europe at the end of World War II and smuggling them into South America, into Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay and Uruguay, and there they were. I mean, and it's important for people to remember, these are real, live people. These are not abstractions. These are not just, somebody with a monocle and 6-league boots, even though that is who Otto Skorzeny was. But it turns out that Otto Skorzeny was the guy who he set up and was running an anti-communist special training academy in Oberammergau in Bavaria, under the auspices of Reinhard Gehlen, who was the Waffen-SS commander of anti-Soviet and anti-Eastern Bloc intelligence, who we ended up establishing an alliance with and making him the head of intelligence for West Germany at the end of World War II for 26 years. And he was the principal source of anti-Soviet intelligence for all of the NATO nations for 26 years. A Nazi. I mean, but it's a lot more important for you to understand is that and I believe this to be true, it was less important that they were Nazis than it is that they were fascists. Because fascism is something that you're going to have to come to understand. Fascism, all fascists are not Nazis. All Nazis are fascists. But there are fascists who aren't members of the Nazi Party. There are fascists who are in fact senior partners in Brown Brothers Harriman. There are fascists who are in fact senior partners in the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. There are in fact fascists who are in fact in the Central Intelligence Agency and in the FBI and in Nasser Haro's office down in Mexico City. There are fascists that have an alliance with each other. Just like from the academy, from the Anti-Communist Special Warfare Training Academy that was run by Otto Skorzeny from 1948 to 1965, they produced 1,200 men. 1,200 men from around the world that were all very high-level intelligence operatives for the Allied nations, including Israel. Okay, in the Mossad, Michael Harari, the guy that was assigned to hunt down and exterminate the Black September people, who in 1972 killed the Olympiads in Munich, killed the Israeli Olympiads. These guys are stone killers. These are fascists who are trained to understand that there's a fascist movement in the world, and that's who these people are. And it turns out that that Peter Dale Scott would come across these guys. They would come across these guys, and he would say, "Oh, they're involved in international narcotics trafficking." Yes, they are. Yes, they are. But the problem is that when you think like a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And the old saying is that when a pickpocket meets a saint, all he sees are his pockets. And so what's happened here is even Peter Dale Scott, even though he realizes that there had to be some sort of higher echelon upstairs somewhere that was giving directions to these people in the CIA, that was giving the green light to people in the Joint Chiefs of Staff like Curtis LeMay or Lemonster or even Arleigh Burke that might want to defy a president and attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro, or send ships from Guantanamo to help supply the ship that was being used in June of 1963 to attempt to put people ashore to assassinate Fidel Castro in open defiance of a direct order from the President of the United States to cease and desist from trying to do that stuff. And they're getting refueled by a ship from Guantanamo. That means that the United States Navy High Command is involved in defying the President of the United States, because they are more loyal to each other, just like those 1,200 men that were all trained by Otto Skorzeny at that academy. They were more loyal to each other horizontally as fascists than they were loyal vertically to the presidents of their countries. and to their legislatures and to their courts. They were in fact an alliance of fascists that were formed before World War II. And that whole fascist movement that began during 1924 to 1933 when Hitler became chancellor in Germany. Okay? So what I'm doing is I'm opening onto this thing. I want you to be familiar with what Peter Dale Scott has said as a matter of principle, that it's clear that there's some higher echelon that is giving directives to these guys. They're greenlighting them killing the President of the United States. That is some sort of bond of alliance that these people have that think that they can all agree that they're going to do something in complete defiance of the president, like assassinate Fidel Castro or overthrow their government, and whether the president supports it or not. And that's what we want to open on to. Yes, Craig.
Okay, so you mentioned a lot of things, but I wanted to pull it back to Peter Dale Scott.
Yes.
1960, early 60s and 63 as much as possible. I know, and you know, Ted Shackley was trained by Skorzeny, was the translator for Reinhold Galen, so he did some time at Oberammergau or whatever there. I don't know if Nasser Harrow was, but what Peter Dale Scott points out in Deep Politics on Oswald, Mexico, and Cuba, a book that he wrote, which was a collection of essays he did shortly before that, he does point out that Nasser Harrow, when he was assistant head of the DFS,
yes,
their equivalent of the FBI, he led the interview, or whatever you would want to call it, interrogation of Sylvia Duran, who was in the embassy, that supposedly was the one who was meeting with Oswald, or the Oswald impersonator. Mm-hmm. And they put, Harrow and the rest of them put tremendous pressure on her to try to get her to admit that she was part of the connection of Oswald and the Soviet assassination expert that he supposedly had met with. If not. Right. So Harrow was involved back then, which brought up a number of other things that he was connected to, including right, counterintelligence and James Angleton, and the FBI assistant William Sullivan, who was right, in the Special right, Investigative Service during World War II over Latin America, and the guy just happened to sit over the top of the district attorney then of Dallas, Wade, sat over Robert Mayhew, the guy who initially had everything kicked off with Nixon, sat over William Harvey, who came up with the ZR rifle program. I mean, there's a whole collection of guys that are in there that Peter Dale Scott actually did come out and say in this right, book that he believed they were a potential clique that worked with outsiders in the assassination. That's right. So that's as close as he got to.
That's exactly this. So what we're saying is that Peter Dale Scott got close. He got close when he started recognizing that there had to be some sort of clique above these guys that was actually authorizing this stuff. And but he misses the boat by thinking that what they had in common is that they were just supportive of this international narcotics trafficking operation that was being used to support covert operations. Wes.
So when Castro came into power, it put it at the end of Harrow into Cuba. Did the CIA end up importing it through somewhere else after that, or did it come to a standstill?
Yeah, what
Southeast Asia.
What happened is that we know that when Shackley went into Laos in 1965, now this is basically 5 years later, from 1959 when it got shut down. By 1965, Shackley is back in Laos and is reopening the heroin trafficking. Okay, so there's a about 4 year, 5 year hiatus right in there, where it's not clear exactly what they were doing about this, how they were getting the heroin in, but they had this easy conduit coming in from Cuba, and they wanted to reopen it. So I don't know the answer to that, but it's a good question. Yes.
So with the ties between the intelligence community and smuggling and drugs, why does it make sense to go after the Medellin cartel and like Pablo Escobar when the U.S. funded Pepe, which basically shut down the entire Medellin cartel?
What they discovered, I'll tell you a little story here, that when we were doing the Iran-Contra investigation, I mentioned that our office got wiretapped. Our phones got wiretapped. And the guy that told me that our phones were wiretapped was Carl Schaffler. Carl Schaffler is the guy that led the team of Washington D.C. police into the Watergate Hotel, that arrested everybody in the Watergate Hotel. Carl tipped me that our phones were all wiretapped, that they'd been wiretapped by the 5 Squad out of New Orleans. And that the New Orleans FBI domestic investigations were asserting that they were investigating the brother of Adolfo Calero, who was the head of the Iran-Contra, and that they thought he was smuggling weapons and drugs, and that's the rationale they used. And they had reason to believe that information pertaining to that operation might be available on our telephones, because we were investigating them, and they weren't, by the way. But so that was the rationale. That was the rationale that they used. And so when I was talking to Carl Schaffler, I got invited to play in the poker game. They have this very famous poker game that goes on in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday nights. And a lot of the kind of top-level investigative journalists like Cy Hirsch and Dan Moldea and Dick Billings and a lot of the others play poker with each other on Wednesday nights. So because of my investigations that I was doing, they invited me to come to the poker games. And that's where I met Carl Schaffler. And there's Carl Schaffler sitting with them. It was like a cabal. So they were all the cabal trying to figure out who the cabal was. And so that's how I met Carl. Carl told me about an investigation that was done. There was an investigation that was conducted looking into the skim that was coming off the casinos, right? And so they were trying to figure out where it went. He's the guy that explained to me about how they took the skim and they put it in these expensive suitcases and put it in the Cadillac cars and drove it through New Orleans and into Miami and put it into Miami National Bank and then wired the money to the International Credit Bank in Geneva, Switzerland, all that stuff I told you about before. He's the guy that told me all about it. He said that while they were doing that investigation, they discovered that some of the money that had gone up into the International Credit Bank, in addition to going down to the Banco Internacional, down into that bank account by Ogario, there was some of it going to this other bank account, which they traced to a guy by the name of Lucien Conin. And it turns out that Lucien Conin was the head of the team that led the coup against Neo-Dendien on November 1st of 1963. Okay, just like 20 days prior to Kennedy being assassinated. The head of state, Neo-Dendien, and his brother-in-law were assassinated by a CIA authorized team. And Kennedy was shocked by that he got assassinated. He was supportive of them overthrowing him, but he wasn't in favor of them killing him.
He expected them to put him in exile.
That's right.
He didn't expect them to put both of them in a tank and stab them and
No.
shoot them to death.
No,
Right.
he didn't expect them to kill him, but they did. And the bottom line is that when Schaffler was on this 5-agency, interagency task force that was designed to investigate the skim coming off the casinos. They called it Operation Croupier. And there were 5 agencies, the narcotics people, the IRS, and a whole bunch of other people. He was on it because Carl was the head of the organized crime strike force in Washington, D.C. And so they were on this thing. And what happened is they discovered this bank account going to this guy, Lucien Conin. And wait a second.
How do you spell that?
Conein, Lucien, Lucien, I guess, Lucien Conin, his name was. And what they discovered is that Lucien Conin was actually working for the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and that he had a team of 10 guys that were working with him inside this special unit, and it turns out they were all former members of the Phoenix Project in Southeast Asia. And so they were all assassins, and they were inside this unit. And so Michael Shaheen, who was the head guy in the Justice Department running this investigation, Operation Croupier, said to himself, whoa, wait a second, this is above my pay grade. I don't know what this is that's going on, but it turns out that it was an assassination group that was set up, that the CIA had put inside the DEA, that were assassinating competitors to the Medellin cocaine cartel. And what they were doing is they were targeting their competitors just exactly like Shackley had done. Just like he had done in Southeast Asia. You eliminate their competitors, and then they rise up. And so what what Conine was doing was assassinating their competitors. And, that's why the movie Patriot Games was such a laugh. To have it, Tom Clancy pretending that the CIA was attempting to get rid of cocaine smuggling in Southeast Asia. They were living off of it, And so that what happened is that they opened up a second 5-agency, interagency task force to investigate this group, because they discovered that what they were doing is they were facilitating the smuggling of cocaine by the people that were surviving the Medellin cocaine cartel, and they were smuggling drugs up out of Mexico and smuggling weapons back to them through El Paso in Texas. And it turns out that they discovered that there was this new interagency task force that they called Operation Gateway, was the code name for it. And they were investigating it, and so Carl Schlaffer went up onto the other task force to look for them. And there was another guy by the name of I'll think of his name in a second. He worked for the IRS. Barrio, his name was. That Barrio, this guy that worked for the IRS, got put on the second task force, and he wanted to go down to El Paso to actually investigate what was happening there. That guys, you're getting a little insight into what my life looks like here. So that they in fact, he wanted to go down to El Paso to investigate what was going on. But every time he put in an application for funding for the authority to get a ticket and go down and have a motel and be able to do the investigation, it was denied over and over again. So Barrio got really, Santo Barrio, his name was. Santo Barrio got really upset about this, so he took a vacation and said he's going to go down there on his own nickel. So he goes down and he sits down with a judge, John Wood, who was the chief federal judge in El Paso, and tells him all about this, that he's part of this major Operation Gateway investigation. He thinks it's being blocked from the top in Washington. They're not letting him come down to investigate it. So he wants to get the judge to set up a special grand jury down in El Paso to investigate this, right? So Judge John Wood, Hanging John, they called him, sends in for the head of the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office in El Paso, and he brings him in, and they sit down and they hatch this plot that they're going to set up a grand jury. And the first guy that they subpoena is this guy by the name of Lee Chagra, F. Lee Chagra. They called him the Black Striker. That he was always dressed in black, and he wore this string tie and these big black cowboy boots. He was a lawyer down in El Paso, and he always defended all the drug smugglers. One of the major ones of which was his brother, actually, Bobby Chagra. And what happened is Lee Chagra was the first guy to get subpoenaed by this grand jury, and they issued the subpoena for him. And on Christmas Eve, after he received a subpoena, 3 guys from Army intelligence come through the door and kill him at his desk and walk out. And so his brother Bobby gets really pissed over this, and he blames Judge Wood for doing it. So what happens is the next day, after this killing of Lee Chagra, the judge sends for the head of the criminal division of the Justice Department there and brings him in. And Santo Barrio comes in, and so they're sitting trying to figure out what to do about this. And they ask the head of the criminal division to come from his home, because it's like Christmas holiday. Ask him to come in. He gets in his car and drives in. He gets halfway to the courthouse, and a big van pulls up and slides the door open on the side and unloads 55 rounds into his car. Okay, and blows his car all up, and he survives. And so then they take him and put him in the witness protection program. And then Santo Barrio ends up getting arrested the next day by the El Paso Police Department. They arrest him and put him in a jail cell, and in the morning they find him dead in his cell. The investigator from the Federal Strike Force, right, is dead. And the head of the criminal division of the Justice Department had his car shot to shit and is just barely alive. And the main witness has been killed. And so they decide what are they going to do. And so Judge John Wood hears that there's been a reward put out to kill him. Turns out Bobby Chagra, Lee Chagra's brother, put out a $1 million bounty on his head to kill him. And so he comes out of his house 2 days later, gets out of his car and gets shot right between the shoulder blades with a high-powered rifle with an explosive mercury tip point and blows him up, right? And so that's what happens, and that investigation closes down. It wasn't that they didn't push back pretty hard, but the fact of the matter, so that what that was all about was discovering that there was a very high-level operation going on, headed up by Lucien Conin, of assassins that were actually deeply involved in assassinating competitors to the Medellin cocaine cartel, which we know from the deputy CIA station chief, Joseph Burkholder Smith, was actually set up by the Nazis. They were actually generating funds to be used to pay for this political assassination operation that was going on in South America. It was called Operation Condor, that we ended up finding out about. One of my investigators actually got into their office where Condor was being run out of and saw the map on the wall where they had the little red pins stuck in wherever they killed somebody, which happened to be inside the security division of Pemex, the Mexican National Oil Company in Mexico City. That's where they had them. Felix Rodriguez, Rafael Chichi Quintero, Orlando Martinez were all there. We're all in that office working with the security division of Pemex that was run by a guy by the name of Jorge Diaz Serrano, who happened to be the business partner of George H.W. Bush and the Zapata Oil Company in Houston, Texas. That's what gives you some pause. What's going on up here? Who is it? Who is it? Who is it that's upstairs? Who is it that's upstairs? And I'll just close with this one, and I'll make you one. That when I got a call from Jerry Zeitman. Jerry Zeitman was the chief counsel for the House Judiciary Committee. He was legal counsel. He called me up and said he had to talk to me about something. And so I said, I'll come over to your office, just like what happened before. He said, no, don't come to the office. I'll meet you. And so I go to this restaurant to meet him, and I bring Sarah with me, right? I get Sarah, my wife, to come with us. So we go in and sit down, and he tells me, he says, look, he said, when I got retained to be the legal counsel for the House Judiciary Committee, he said, I was so proud. I felt that I'd been basically brought on to play the organ in the main church. And he said, but then I later discovered that what was going on was that I wasn't being brought in to play the organ in the church. I was being asked to play honky-tonk piano in a whorehouse. He said, but at least I thought I knew what was going on upstairs. But people weren't upstairs getting fucked. They were getting murdered. That's what he said to me. That's the chief counsel for the House Judiciary Committee when he stumbled on to this massive murder operation that they had going. And that this murder operation was going to protect the operations that they had going. And that's why when Kennedy got crossways of it, he ended up in a crossway of these people. I'll talk to you later, Wes. I think that I can't keep you over because you have to get ready for Turkey Day. Okay? So I'll have your papers all back for you graded by Tuesday. But when we get back Tuesday, I'll tell you what's really going on.